Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast episode number 46. In this episode, I had the pleasure to talk to Rob Humble. Rob is co-founder of Hybrid, a Seattle-based architecture company established in design, building, and development. Hybrid has also developed a community gallery dedicated to discussing deeper issues in urbanism, art, and design called Hybrid Space. In my opinion, this practice is for sure aligned with their livability manifesto, which I suggest you to go and read on their website, which you can access from the links below and the podcast notes. But before the conversation starts, I want to thank you for supporting and listening to the podcast. This month, we have reached another milestone, which was going over 5,000 downloads, which is amazing. If you haven't yet, you can support us by simply following our social media channels, which are also linked below, which are Instagram at TCI Podcast, and also LinkedIn, the LinkedIn page, The Creative Insider. And if you want to get each month the best of TCI Podcast, feel free to subscribe for our newsletter. So thank you one more time and enjoy the conversation with Rob Humble.
The whole world stops just like that. The whole world stops just like that.
Hello, Rob. Nice to meet you, and another intercontinental podcast with Seattle. I'm based in Frankfurt. It's a cozy evening, and you're starting your day. Drinking beer on the side, which might look weird to you. But welcome on the Creative Insider.
Thanks for having me, Georgi.
Thank you for accepting. I told you that I was positively surprised because usually people need a little longer time because everybody in the architectural field are very busy. But you were quite quick and you didn't have any questions before the podcast, so that was very easy. And thank you for that. And I'm super excited because you're our first, so to say, American-based architect on the podcast. And I'm very curious to discover a lot about what you do and your practice and your background. Because before this pandemic kicked in, I was very interested into moving to the US. Because originally I'm from Bulgaria, which is an Eastern European country. And post-communism, we were super attracted to the US because that was the most contrasting thing to what we had in our surroundings. This nice movies we were used to watch, and so it's a very big pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you on this podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for reaching out. I think when you messaged me, I was excited for the opportunity to, talk with you as well. I like architects. I've got a lot of my best friends, of course, are architects, and it's also interesting to me to connect to someone, on the other side of the world and understand a little bit more about how they go about their profession and what their values
are. As I was telling you in our conversation before we started the podcast, what is really interesting to me is that you're the founding partner of Hybrid Architects or Architecture in Seattle.
Right, Hybrid Architecture
in Seattle,
yes.
And I graduated 2 years ago, but I have started my professional experience already 5 years ago here in Germany. And when I'm freshly, so to say, still freshly out of university, and I still have a lot of I'm still very up to date with what are the current, so to say, flows in the architectural world. And I never had as references on my university project a lot of American architecture, because here in Europe we have this sort of misconception. We are also taught in the university only older projects from American architects, and we have this misconception that whatever is built in the US, it's not that long term. It's mainly quick build mega mansions and stuff like that. So your architecture was very much European, and I saw you also are trying to have a neighborhood community which discuss urbanism, art, design. So that was a very interesting aspect. Could you tell me more about that, and what is your philosophy in general?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, the European influence. When I grew up in Texas, San Antonio, Texas, and went to college in Texas, and I liked Texas. That was really all I knew for the first 23 years of my life. But I didn't really like the way the Texas cities grew. There's a lot of land, and they just sprawl out, and it's very auto dependent part of the country. And after I graduated, I sold most all of my belongings, and I traveled in Europe for several months and spent time in Frankfurt, and really kind of saw how European cities were more dense, more walkable, more humanistic, and it was refreshing to kind of see even most large American cities don't have those attributes. There's some exceptions, maybe New York or San Francisco, or even like really smaller towns are still very walkable, but a lot of the country is really just kind of sprawled out. So being exposed to European cities and the architecture as well, but mostly just the city itself, I was inspired by that. And when it was time to finish my trip, I wanted to seek out in a new location that also valued what I thought were walkable neighborhoods and maybe a little more liberal or democratic approach to social issues. So, and also at the time, this was in 1993. So this was at the very boom, at the apex of the grunge explosion. So everywhere I was, it didn't matter where I was in Europe, in a hostel, in a bar, in a hotel, all the music we heard was coming out of Seattle, and the fashion was coming out of Seattle. So when I had to kind of come back to the United States, I wanted to move somewhere new that was interesting and exciting. So I moved to Seattle in 1993. Didn't really know anybody in the profession here, and it was also in the middle of recession. It took several months to get my first job opportunity here, but eventually I did, and basically I've stayed. I've been here for almost 30 years. And I really also like Seattle. Once again, I thought Seattle was a more of a West Coast vibe, which is generally more liberal, more socially liberal, but also I wanted to go to a place where I felt like I could have, a city that was going to grow, a city whose values reflected mine, and a city that I could frankly get built. I wanted to have projects and be able to establish a career in a city that I thought was going to grow a lot. And Seattle has grown a lot in the 30 years I've been here. We have now mass transit that wasn't here initially. We have, it's a real focus on the urban core. I walk to work. I rarely drive, and it's been the best thing I think any architect can do is have a career in a place that you think that really reflects your values for what a city should be, as well as a place where there's a lot of old cities where there's kind of an old guard and an established, entrenched, system of who the architects are. So it's fun to go to a city that's growing, knowing that you can have creative ideas and establish a career outside of that, the old guard.
Yeah, and it's ironic, but my girlfriend, she's basically American because she was born in California, but of course, her parents are German, and so she grew up there, and then at some point in her life, she moved to Seattle, and she takes a lot of pictures. So once we went through the pictures of Seattle, and to me, it seemed a pretty European styled city. It's not what you can expect from an American city, because it was very well. It seemed very connected to the coast, to the water. but also I guess you have a very beautiful nature there, because I saw a mountain very close also there. So I was really surprised by the city, because, as I said, we have this misconception of, the this megalopolis you have there in the US, where everything is car based. I think now slowly cities are starting to transition, because I've read a book from Young Gell. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Livable Cities is the book, and then there was also Life Between Buildings.
Yep.
So it was a very interesting analysis of how a city works and how we interact as human beings. Because his wife is a psychologist. I've mentioned that already in other podcasts. And yeah, do you think Seattle is a little bit more European? Am I correct from what I've seen on pictures, at least?
I think so. And I actually just reread uh, Life Between Buildings myself, the young gal, and it was, I think I probably read it in college and just reread it again a few months ago. And I mean, they're very practical solutions to, creating vibrant, socially based cities. And I think, yeah, Seattle is kind of, it is, there's a, where the city itself is kind of squeezed between the Puget Sound, which is saltwater, body of water, and Lake Union, which is a freshwater, and there's lakes and saltwater on both sides, and then mountains. So there's really not a lot of opportunity to sprawl. You'd have to, that you're confounded by all this water. So I think Seattle a long time ago recognized that and realized that they were going to accommodate more a growing population, they were going to have to densify their city, and for the success of the city, have to do it in a way that is is more livable. So in the time I've been here, they don't, there used to be parking restrictions. So for every apartment building you would build, you'd have to have a parking spot. Now, for the last several years, there are no parking requirements in the city of Seattle. So you can build a 50-unit building without any parking whatsoever. And, a lot of the people that work with us, they also, they don't even own cars and are using mass transit and walking. So I think that's something kind of unique about Seattle. I'd say Portland is in Oregon, probably just a couple hours south of where we are, also on the coast. It's a little bit smaller city, but also kind of reflects those same values. So there's kind of this, in the Pacific Northwest, there's this kind of a culture that is probably more urban than a lot of the center of the country for sure. But it's also not a megalopolis. If you go to the East Coast, like New York and Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, those are big, big, big cities. And these are smaller cities out here, at least in the Pacific Northwest, but have kind of a new progressive way of densifying. And they're also younger cities. So once again, there's just lots of opportunity for building. I'm looking out my window. I see 4 or 5 cranes, within a quarter mile of where I'm sitting right now.
Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect. I'm curious, because you mentioned before that you have. Are you actually were you born in Texas and then you moved?
Yeah, I was
Uh,
born in Texas. My whole family's still in Texas.
that's very interesting to me, because I think another thing that is very fascinating to me from the US, although I've never had the opportunity to visit, because unfortunately, when I was supposed to come and visit, the whole pandemic enveloped, and we all know how it's going on currently. But the thing is that, for example, here in Europe, I moved from Italy to Germany, and the flight is 1 hour, so to say 1.5 hour, and you land like in a completely different world. Regulations, language, culture is completely different. And I'm curious, is it the same in the US? Like, because a lot of people that I know from the US, they usually decide to move in another part of the US, which in our scale here in Europe would be moving somewhere so far away, but you're still in the same country. Is it the culture very, very different between the different states, or there is some common ground that goes through?
Well, no, it is very, very different. And I thought that was one of the great things about Europe. Yeah, you could get on a train or a plane, and in an hour's time, you could be in an entirely different country and different culture and different language. And it was also tight, so it was great to kind of have that exposure. I think when I traveled, I probably went to 6 or 8 different countries, and ended up, kind of running low on money for the last month or so I was there. And I took a one-way train, actually hopped a train without a ticket to Prague, and that was right when that was opening up. And then I ran out of money in Prague, so we hopped another train even further out into the country. It's been a couple, kind of a resort. I guess it was really a summer vacation resort, but we were there in the winter, so it was pretty. The workers were there, but there were really no tourists there, so we really got really enmeshed into a more rural Eastern European culture, which was interesting. But yeah, the United States is obviously, it's a really big place. We just had a presidential election recently, and obviously the country was bitterly divided between what a lot of the country believes with Donald Trump, and what the balance of the country believes in Biden. And it's they, as far apart as they are, the election was pretty. It's practically 50-50. You don't win. It's never really a landslide. And really what it boils down to, I think, is that, generally people that choose to live in American cities, they choose it for the culture. They choose it for their urbanity. They choose a certain lifestyle that's not auto dependent. And it's kind of self-selecting. They generally are going to be, maybe more liberally biased. But obviously there's a lot of other country that is more rural and spread out. And I wouldn't say exclusively, but have a tendency to be, more conservative, culturally biased, because they live in these small towns, and they don't want small towns to change. For instance, they don't want new people, immigrants, moving in and changing it and kind of like losing their place in the culture. I think, frankly, there's a lot of protectionism from white America, that they're afraid that there's a lot of immigrants that are moving to the country, and it's kind of devaluing their culture. But the irony is that these white Americans are also immigrants. At one time, there's indigenous communities in the United States, but most every person in the United States at one point or another, their heritage came from European culture, or Central American, or South American. So it is really a melting pot. And that is one thing actually great, particularly about if you have the opportunity to go to New York City, you really understand the microcosm what America is. It is extremely culturally diverse. Walking down the sidewalk, you hear many languages. You see many different cultures. There's tons and tons of food. And what you really think New York it really is a melting pot of all these different cultures. And that's really one thing great about, some of the larger cities in the United States.
Yeah, I think that as a European, it was always very fascinating to me that, for example, in Europe, we have, depending on what you're called, your name, even like your name and family name, you can say, okay, he's French, he's German, he's Italian, he's Bulgarian. And in the US, you could be called whatever, and you'll still be American. I'm not aware with the whole racism issue in the US, because it's very hard to understand from the European perspective, because no matter who gets arrested here in Europe, it's there are very few exceptions. If someone gets killed, it's a very extreme situation. And I think that a little bit, what helps a little bit is that we don't have such a easy allowance to possess guns also. So probably police officers are less afraid or scared to be actually attacked back somehow. So this is some social issues that here are just barely reflected, because we don't have this much police violence, and or in general guns here are some exception. But to go back to your story, I'm very curious, because you mentioned you moved in 93 in Seattle, and there was a recession, which I'm not aware of because I was one in that year, and probably my parents weren't even they weren't aware that much because they were just transitioning through very wild years in Eastern Europe. But how did you move to Seattle? How did you settle there? What was your first job? And I don't know, how did your education work? Do you need to have? Did you have already a master degree from Texas? How did it develop?
Well, I went to Texas Tech, which is in Lubbock, Texas, kind of in the northern part of Texas, and I actually had a 5-year undergraduate degree, which I think now it's a 5-year master's degree, but at the time I did it, it was 5 years. So, yeah, so it was a 5-year program. Frankly, it took the great majority of people, myself included, 6 years to get through it. Like maybe 15% of people would actually complete it in 5, but you'd have to go to summer school every semester. You'd have to really take a full load to get through it in 5. So most people did it in 6. And then, yeah, when I moved to Seattle, it was a recession. And I think at the time it was really transitioning from kind of hand drafting to computer-based drafting. So I had taken, like, as an elective, one course in computer drafting in college, and that was the extent of it. And one of my problems when I moved to Seattle is I didn't know, a lot of the larger firms had already transitioned to AutoCAD, and I didn't know AutoCAD. So, and I'd actually had 2 summers of work experience, but it was all hand drafting. So it was a real challenge in a recession to get an opportunity because I didn't know the software. And eventually I was hired by a large firm, NBBJ, which is a pretty international firm here based in Seattle. And I was hired to really just do some construction administration for a big hospital that was under construction in Alaska. And eventually, after a few months of that, I got the opportunity to start working on some competition teams that were creating designs in China and in Korea at the time. And then I was building models and doing presentation drawings. So that was a lot of fun, kind of being involved in the front end of these projects. And that was really my big break, I guess, in the profession. And eventually, and this was all on contract basis, basically hourly. I had signed originally like 2-week contract that extended to a month, that extended to 2 months, essentially it extended to 6 or 8 months. And eventually this big firm offered me a full-time job. And I turned it down because I saw people that were, maybe 3 or 4 years out of profession working for this big firm. And in the 3 or 4 years they've been working there, they'd only worked on one project, one gigantic, hospital in another state. And I wasn't, frankly, very interested in doing hospitals, and I wasn't that interested in doing those gigantic buildings. I wanted more, access to smaller projects that would design and permit faster and get exposed to a lot of things. And also, I always liked residential architecture. So when I turned down the job opportunity at NBBJ, I worked for a smaller firm, and they actually ended up giving me opportunities to design. And, I would work nights, I would work weekends, I would work all of my own time to design things outside of the work environment, really unpaid. But I just loved that. I relished the opportunity. So things really kind of took off from there. That was the start of my career.
After how long did you work a little bit for the big firm? How long, and then you moved to this smaller office?
I think I was at the big firm, like I say, maybe about a year in total. Then I was at the smaller office for 2 or 3 years, and then their work ended up getting slow. So I started working once again hourly on a contract basis for another architect, and I always, I had some autonomy, and I could show up to work when I wanted to. I would send them an invoice for the work that I had created, and they would write me a check for it. So I was kind of self-employed at that point as a contract architect, and I really, really enjoyed that. I was always kind of entrepreneurial when I was young, mowed lawns and do whatever to kind of make my own money, and I always kind of thought I wanted to own my own business. So really, probably took me about 5 years or so, maybe 6 years after I was out of college, and got licensed and started my own business immediately. In fact, I had started my business even before I was licensed, and it was really important that I pass all the licensure tests because I had to stamp some drawings for a project I had already designed. But I really took that opportunity when I was still pretty young to start my own business. Once again, partly for the architecture, but also just I enjoyed having my own business. I enjoyed the freedom of it, and I have been. That was probably in 1998, so that's been 24 years now. I've been working for myself. And, the first business I had was called Robert Humble Architects, and it really would just take kind of any work, any opportunity that would come to me. But after several years of doing that, I didn't really appreciate the portfolio of work I had done. It was more single family houses out in the suburbs. It didn't really reflect the values I moved to Seattle for. So around this time, I started entering competitions with a friend of mine under the name Hybrid. And we ended up getting some exposure and notoriety under this competition team that eventually led to projects. So for the first 2 or 3 years we had Hybrid, we had absolutely zero income from it. We were entering competitions, we were doing things for free, we were getting actually published a lot with a lot of unbuilt work. So we were actually internationally recognized, but had no income. And during this time, but we were making our income from my other architecture firm, Robert Humble Architects, who was basically providing us a salary during the day while we were working at night on these competitions. But eventually, we got a client for Hybrid, and then very quickly that snowballed into multiple clients, and Hybrid really kind of took off in a pretty short time frame after we got our first client. And then I closed Robert Humble Architects, and once again, Hybrid was always based, because it was based on competitions, that it was a value-based organization. We had strong values that we wanted to reflect in the competition entries, and it actually ended up attracting clients who shared those values. So Hybrid has been a sustainable firm, since then, because it was really built on a foundation of strong values that are reflected in the architecture.
Yeah, you said a lot of things, and now I have a lot of questions in my head. So I'm going to start with the first one. You mentioned you needed around 5 years to get your license as an architect, and my question would be, how is that process? How does that process look like in the U.S.? Because here, for example, in Italy, right after you get your master degree in architecture, you can go and take an exam, and then if you pass that exam, which is a couple of days exams where you need to develop a project, and then you have to write something about it, and then you get asked about it, but then you're a licensed architect. In Germany works differently. You have to work 2 years after your graduation in the in the field. And here in Germany, by law, so to say, there are phases of the projects which are well defined, and you need to work in through all the phases. You have to have at least 6 months in construction place experience, where you go do controlling, and then take some. You have to go and get 80 points from conferences, which means there are certain conference which you attend, and then through the lectures you get points. So I'm curious, how does that work in the US?
It's probably pretty similar to that model. You basically, nowadays, you have to have a master's degree generally, and then you get a job and you have to intern for generally about 5 or 6 years is what it takes. But it could take, it rarely takes less than 5 years, but it could take 15 years if you're not tracking it correctly. So once again, let's just say it takes 5 years, and similarly, you kind of have to have work experience in all these different aspects of the project, from schematic design, and permitting, all the way through construction administration. And once you've kind of completed those hours, they call IDP hours, once you've kind of added them all up, they say, okay, you're ready to take the test. And then they give a test, and I think it's in 9 parts now, that also has different aspects of, the profession. And you used to have to take it all in one day, but now you kind of can do it on a computer, and you can take it over several days. And then after you pass all the tests, it's also pretty rare, frankly, for people to pass all 9 sections the first time around. Um, I was happy I did, but that's, they're hard. They're hard tests, and it's hard to be good at all of that. It's structural engineering, all these things that, some people, I wasn't particularly interested in structural engineering in college, so I had to really study up for those tests and work hard to study. Anyway, after you pass all the 9 tests, then you have to take a verbal exam where someone sits down in front of you and they quiz you about all these kind of things. And then once you pass that, they kind of tell you right then and there, like, okay, I remember when I was sat down I was real proud of myself because I went through my internship pretty fast. It was always like, it's kind of a feather in your cap if you can get licensed before 30. And I think I moved out of Seattle when I was 24. And I hustled through my internship, I guess, in the 5 years, and I started taking the test. And I passed all the tests for some round. I thought, oh, this is awesome. I'm real proud of myself. And then I went to take that verbal test, and I just got grilled. This person was just like, so you think you're ready to be an architect, are you? Well, you don't know squat. Here's what I think of you. You're going to get out there and do serious damage to the world. And I was kind of set aback, but she ended up passing me and told me right there, okay, well, I guess you passed. And I remember like driving home from the exam and just kind of thinking, all right, I'm an architect now. And I was 29 years old, and I started college when I was 18. It took me 11 years to get there. And it seemed like at the same time, such a sense of accomplishment, but also like such a letdown. I was just kind of like, well, now I'm an architect. now what? It took forever, and that's what I always wanted to be. Since I was 16, I wanted to be an architect, and now I'm 29 and I'm an architect. And it's just kind of a bit of a letdown. It's just kind of like, now I've accomplished this. My life is the same. I'm going to go back to the same job tomorrow. Now what?
But you mentioned now that you wanted to be an architect since you were 16. What made you want to be an architect? Was there someone in your family who was an architect, or was there, like, I don't know, some moment really in your life that
No, I think, I grew up in the suburbs of Texas where, you're building lots of one of these sprawling towns where they're building lots of new homes around you. So there was kind of a big wooded area behind my house. So me and my friends, we would always go kind of raid these construction sites down the street and take wood from them. And then we'd go up in the woods and build forts. So all summer, I would always be building things out in the woods. So I really had a bigger interest in construction when I was a kid. And honestly wasn't particularly artistic when I was a kid. I never took any art classes, but I liked building things. So I kind of thought maybe I'd go to college and become a general contractor. And I think my mom or my aunt kind of pushed me in the direction of being an architect. So I actually took a couple classes in drafting and architecture-based classes while I was still in high school, and really enjoyed that. So my introduction to architecture was really more through the love of building.
I see. And in the next phase, after you become an architect, um, how did you transition from working whether as an employee or you were on an hourly based sort of rate or contract? Because they say to get a client to want you to build something, you need to have built at least already one building. And it's always hard to find this early adapter who trusts you in putting in your hand so much money for whatever building, even if it's a small building. When people spend money on something, they're very careful. So did you create some connections during your career that were then your clients, or how did you start this part?
Well, when Hybrid started as a competition team, one of the competitions that we used was actually the redevelopment of a kind of a port terminal here in Seattle, where all the ships are loaded and unloaded, and they were going to considering redeveloping that portion of land. So we entered the competition and created basically a kind of a movable city that was used as cargo containers as a basis of construction. This was instead of like taking these several acres of land on the waterfront and building these big high rises all at one time in an area that's pretty remote from the rest of the city right now, we thought it'd be more interesting to kind of have a incubator city that would maybe have these smaller buildings and little bodegas, and people would start to move there, and eventually maybe a bar would open up, and then permanent buildings would start to kind of be developed around that, and then we would take apart our little incubator town and move it a little bit further onto the fringe. So, but probably the important thing is that we use the cargo container as the kind of the basis of construction, and then and even more so now, like people are just crazy about containers. So that's when we ended up getting published so much. We'd be on the cover of magazines and all kinds of Vanity Fair about doing just speculative container designs. But we always thought the containers were really more of a jumping off point to modular work. So we were always interested in doing modular work. In fact, I'm calling you right now. I live in a modular house. It's not a container house. It's a wood frame house. So we developed this specialty in modular construction, and that actually became the kind of the introduction to a lot of our clients. Eventually we'd done some modular houses, we'd done some modular cabins, and someone wanted to do a modular apartment building. And we had never done an apartment building, but we had done modular. So that's really what gave us our opportunity to do these apartment buildings, not through experience doing apartment buildings, but with experience doing modular. So that was really it really has been like that specialty has been the introduction to a lot of their clients and the work that we still do.
Yes, I can see a lot of that on your website, and I'm curious. You said that so you were working with Robert Humble architects or
Yeah.
architecture as
Mm-hmm.
a freelance, so to say, by getting your bills paid, because we all need to do that. So also, it's an important aspect. And you were doing a lot of competitions with hybrid already, and your partner, I suppose, back then.
Yeah,
Or
Joel. Yeah, my original partner was Joel Egan that founded Hybrid with me. We split ways probably 7-8 years ago, but he was fundamental in the creation of Hybrid for sure.
my curiosity is, back in the days, I don't know, from what I understood, you're now married. In like, how did you balance your work and life harmony, so to say? Because this is pretty easy when, for example, that's also a reason why a lot of architects get married together to each other, because it's really like then easy to work together, spend the time on working together, or in case you don't work together, you understand each other because you are aware of the business. But what was the case for you? I'm curious also about that aspect of your life.
Yeah, well, it was probably around the time when I started Hybrid, really, when I started dating my current wife. And, she's an interesting, exciting person, and she has her own interests. And at the time, I think she wanted to go back to school to become a nurse and had her own career. Um, and, thankfully she supported me in my career. But also I think it was at the time, we were still pretty young. We were living in an apartment. We shared a car. We didn't have a lot of expenses. We could kind of live pretty cheaply. And probably most importantly, we didn't have any kids, so in fact, we still don't have any kids, but, I think that was an important thing that I could understand would be hard to do. If someone has 2 or 3 kids and you choose to strike it out on your own, when you have a house payment or car payment or kids in school or going to preschool, I think there's a lot more demand, economically on you. Whereas when you're younger, you can just kind of choose to not necessarily live in poverty, but certainly live live more meagerly, which we did for several years. I mean, we kind of made those sacrifices, but it was fine. I mean, it's like I was just excited. We were both excited to just be doing our thing in an exciting place.
Yeah, I think also a problem is that, if you don't spend, it's something you need to figure out on your own, because if you spend too much time on work, then that can tear apart your relationships. But also, if you don't spend enough time on work, that still can tear apart your relationship, because you won't feel good with yourself. So it's a very fine line that you have to walk there. So I guess you found the right groove.
Well, I think
And
one thing that's interesting, I think the more experienced you become, and if you can develop a philosophical approach to your architecture, you can you can do a lot of the work in your head, walking around. I spend a lot of time just walking around the city, and you can really think about. Normally what we'll do is like, oh, I'll get a new project. I'll immediately, print out site plan to scale, try to understand where the sun is, where the access is, what are the constraints on the site, and do a couple sketches just so I kind of understand the pieces of the puzzle. And then you can just think about it a lot. A lot of the work is just conceptualizing things in your head, and you can kind of visualize certain solutions. And then when you sit down to execute them, it happens pretty fast. I find like now I don't have to work as long hours as I used to. But I don't, I might work 50 hours a week, but I enjoy it. Sometimes my wife's working on the Saturday. I'll stay at home and do work on SketchUp or something on Saturday. I enjoy it. I don't work late at night though.
and
Generally, it's like I don't work past 6 or 7 at night anymore. Usually I'm done by 6. Frankly, I don't start at 7 in the morning either.
I think also that by being in charge, also you can also regulate the kind of projects you pick, so that it's, because sometimes when you're employed, your boss decides to get a project which has a crazy deadline, and you kind of don't have the choice to say no or yes. But what was your workflow in the beginning when you started this office, where you just got the two of you guys, you were the team, and you got, I guess, AutoCAD back in the days, and you work with that, or what was, because also, you need an initial investment. Did you have your own space where you went to work, or you were working from home? Maybe were you these pioneers of home office? Who knows?
Yeah, I had a home office for a couple of years while I was having Robert Humble Architects, and I mean, I kind of liked it, but not really. You'd be just like, I would find that, a couple of days could go by and you never really saw anyone else or got outside the house far. Or also there'd be a tendency to work a lot in those times. It would be like, you'd finish work at 5 or 6 or whatever, you'd have some dinner, and then you're sitting around bored at home and like, I don't want to sit down and watch TV. So I just go in there and work some more. So I'd end up, working just because it was there and it kept me occupied. Um, so about the time we started hybrid, we got a dedicated office space outside the home, and once again paid for by Robert Humble Architects. It was the income we were making through that firm that paid the rent, that bought the computers, that paid us our own salary while were developing hybrid. And I remember when we first, after a couple of years, once again of no money, we eventually got some small jobs in hybrid. And I think Joel first started working 50% of the time for hybrid and getting paid 50% of his salary for hybrid, while I was still getting 100% of my salary from the other firm. And then we got a little bit more work, and I started getting 50% of my salary from hybrid, and then a little bit more. And Joel went then full time working for hybrid, and probably maybe it took a couple of years to the point then I was able to get my full salary now from hybrid, and that's when I just closed the other Robert Humble Architecture firm.
I see. And when was there? What were your first projects that were bringing that money in? Were there, like, again, some modular containers buildings? That was your sort of branding in the beginning, or?
Yeah, that really was like, in fact, Joel coined the term cargotecture. I don't know if you heard that term, but Joel made it up. He was really good at marketing and public relations. His wife was the director of public relations of the Sail Art Museum here, and he was a good kind of salesperson, you could say, and a big enthusiastic cheerleader. So we actually, once again, we were getting published a lot, and we ended up actually get an opportunity to do a television show that wanted to feature a cargo container project, and we had never built a cargo container project. So we kind of convinced them, like, why don't we do a television show about us creating a cargo container project? So with that opportunity of this television show, we ended up getting containers donated, and we got the fabricator donated his time and all the materials donated to kind of build this cabin that we call the Studio 320 that's still out on our website. Once again, with no client. There was no buyer for this thing. There was no client. It was really, the client was the TV show. But we followed through with that. We got some really good professional photographs of it. And then it got published in a local newspaper by the architecture critic. And he had nice things to say about it. And that was then read by the president or CEO of a big development company here in Seattle, who was just interested in modular and doing modular big buildings. So that's when the real, waterfall happened. He gave us a call, and that's really when it kind of came together as a business. So once again, like, doing competitions, then doing this project that didn't even have a client, that we could have just photographed this thing out in a parking lot somewhere when it was done, but we went to the trouble to drag it deep into the woods, and put it back together in the woods, because we thought it'd be kind of a poetic, photography, really, to have this big industrial rusted steel box sitting next to these old growth trees. And it was all in an attempt to know that, that would have resonance kind of in photography as a kind of conceptual piece. And it did. That one also got published a lot. But there was never a client for it. In fact, it's still out there in the woods. I don't know if it's ever actually been used. It never even got plumbing installed. It was never entirely functional. We would turn on the lights with a generator. And I stayed in it one night. It was freezing ass cold. But we really enjoyed doing it. It wasn't the point. The point was to create a provocative piece of architecture. And it definitely did that. And that's been a challenge, frankly, to do something that's provocative of that with our clients in our larger projects. As the firm has grown and we've gotten bigger projects, there's a lot of responsibility as the architect you're responsible to someone else's money. And it's hard to kind of push the envelope as far with these larger projects as we do in some of the smaller ones. And I think I mentioned, we also, one unique aspect of what we do is we also develop our own projects where we are the clients, where we buy the land, we design the building, we're general contractors and build them as well, and then end up selling them. And that's an opportunity on these somewhat smaller scale projects to push the envelope a little bit further for design or values that we think are important that eventually have resonance and kind of find their way into our larger buildings. So once again, it's like, it's kind of an entrepreneurial approach. I think all along we've been very entrepreneurial about starting our own business, not waiting for the phone to ring for a client. Go and build something of your own and then get it published and get it noticed and continue to build our own things. We've developed, a dozen projects over the last 10 or 12 years and continue to do that. And those are frankly the best ones. The things on the portfolio that I'm most proud of are the ones that we were our own clients and built them ourselves and sold them. Obviously, we have complete ownership of those. We can do anything we want.
Yeah, it's I think that the most integrated a process is, the better it is, because, for example, I currently work at one of the top 20 for sure companies in the world, like for size at least, and for earnings or whatever. But we are an integrated planning company, which means in the house we have everything you need to complete a building from A to Z, and the process, the fact that we are one team, very integrated, we work really literally in the same file, makes it way better than you would do it separately with all the misunderstandings that can arise between the different um, players in a process like that. At which point could you start being also the developer? Because as you said, you started with this small container architecture, this cargotecture, as you called it. And after how long did you have the capital, so to say, to starting also your own development project?
Well, I think hybrid really kind of started to get its first clients probably around 2004, and around that same time, you know, I uh, I guess it was earlier than that actually, probably like 1999. A cousin of mine that lived up here got divorced, and he needed to find a new place to live. So he and I wanted to be able to buy a house, but couldn't really afford to do it myself. So the two of us went in together and bought this old, like 100-year-old house on a nice part of town, and the house needed a ton of work. So what we did is, for about 3 or 4 years, like we lived in that house and fixed it up. Every single surface of the house, all the four sides of the outside had to be stripped and repainted. Every single finish on the inside had to be redone. And it was that I did not enjoy. I did not, you feel like you work a lot in architecture, but at the same time, I always feel like I needed, and we did all the work ourselves because we couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. So I'd always feel like there's some project going on. I'd have a bathroom, without the toilet installed that I have to try to use. And there's always these projects in the house related to getting done. But anyway, that was once again a sacrifice that I made for 3 or 4 years and living with my cousin. And we ended up selling. At the end of the day, the whole plan was always to sell the house. So when we sold the house, I think we split $150,000. So we each got $75,000. Now I had $75,000. I would have never been able to save that on my own. But I took that money and basically bought a lot with another friend of mine that we did our first development project. So that's really how we did that. I kind of worked hard on my remodel project to make some money, and then I immediately took that money and bought a site that we could build out. And that was basically the seed capital for everything we've continued to do.
But how did you manage to buy the house in the first place, the one that you refurbished?
I don't know. At the time, there was like, I don't know if you remember, like in 2009, there was this big banking crisis where the whole global financial collapse, and a lot of that was based on banking, and they would give you what you'd call a non-verified loan. So anyway, if banks were just giving away money, you could just tell them that you earned $100,000 and they didn't verify it. So you could literally, they would loan money to anybody. They didn't question at all the fact that I had an income of probably $20,000 that year when I bought the house. My cousin was an engineer at Boeing, so he had a good, stable engineering income, so he was able to probably help qualify for the house. But yeah, they would just give away money at the time. The banks would just lend to anybody, and of course, 3 or 4 years later, it led to a huge financial collapse, which ironically happened in the middle of my first development project. When I said I bought this lot with a friend of mine, and we developed 4 townhouses on it on our website called the Remington Court, which I'm still super proud of. It's a beautiful project. But we were in the middle of framing, like just started construction of this project when the banking industry collapsed and the world went into a global recession. And I was just like, oh, I'm going to lose everything. By the time I was, after I had sold the house with my cousin, I went back to living in an apartment. And at the time that I was living with, who was then my girlfriend, who became my wife, we didn't have, all the money I had was in this project. We didn't have any other money. If I had the bank come take the project back, they couldn't have taken anything more from me because I didn't have anything more. So we really took a risk, and at the end of the project, I was very proud of it. We ended up selling it. I actually ended up losing money on that development project, not a lot, like $20,000 or so. So But what that meant is that when the project was done, I might have put $75,000 into it and spent a year or more of my life building it. But I put $75,000 in and I got $55,000 back out. And immediately I took that $55,000 and I put a down payment on a piece of land that we ended up building our own house, because now the world was in recession. And there was really no work to be had. So what happened is I bought a vacant piece of land, designed a modular house for myself, and acted as my own general contractor and paid myself to basically build my own house during the recession. And that's kind of how we got through that economic period, building a house for myself. I still live in the house. I really like it. But there's been a lot of ups and downs. I mean, geez, we've lived through, in the course of my career, I've gone through, first there was a technology bust, when all the tech stocks went down, that was big time affected Seattle. Then there was an earthquake. Then there was 9/11 when the planes flew into New York City. Then there was the big recession in '97. Now there's a pandemic. Ugh, it hasn't it hasn't always been easy.
Now I think it's a huge global crisis, and we'll see how it's gonna really affect the world. When the whole thing is over and we actually can focus on checking that. But yeah, from the crisis you mentioned, the first that I remember so vividly, it's the 9/11. That was a crazy. I think that everybody who are in, at least in the west part of the world, remember that day, because I just we were on the beach. I was back in Italy with, I was 9, I think, and or even 8, and we went back home and we saw all the TVs were showing the same thing. It was so crazy. It seemed incredible. And
Yeah, that was a scary time, I guess, to be in the United States. I guess, Europeans have a culture and a history of being invaded throughout history. It never had like an attack on American soil, not on the mainland. Maybe you had like Pearl Harbor, that was on Hawaii island. This was an attack on the mainland. It really shook people up. They felt very, very vulnerable. And where people were really concerned that there was just going to be multiple attacks. It was going to be the first of many, many, many. And that never really happened. But definitely it was a wake-up call for America. And what a big, Jesus, they collapsed the World Trade Centers. That's a big, that's pretty, once again, you talk about big photographic moments that etch in people's memory. That is, obviously, that's a huge symbol of capitalism. And people just forget, like, well, they also flew a plane into the Pentagon. That's the center of the military in the United States. So imagine if they had just flown a plane into the Pentagon. People were like, holy crap, they flew a plane into the Pentagon. People forget all about that. They don't even care about the Pentagon. It's, that's like peanuts next to flying it into the World Trade Centers.
Yeah, and well, I think that was pretty intense moments. But I have to say that recently, when I think the 6th of January, 7th of January, when the people stormed the Capitol in the US, uh, I was also very much surprised, because I was thinking, damn, like, a part of the whole thing, they said, that all the senators and all the people in the parliament were in danger for their lives, which probably was true. But you give some incredible access to documents and things they probably have in that building to some random people, and that was to me like, why nobody is saying that exact words, that these people could have stolen some, I don't know, they were selling, I think, Nancy Pelosi laptop on eBay. They were crazy people for sure, because they had the great opportunity to use at least a mask, but that was against its philosophy.
Oh yeah,
It
it's just a joke. It's like, what a disaster that was. It's just like,
yeah, that
once again,
was
consider the country is so divided, and Donald Trump, like, he was long before, months before the election, he was already saying it was going to be a corrupt election. Even before they had the election, he said it was going to be tainted, and then of course it happened, and he didn't win, and then he wouldn't admit that he lost and fought all these ways, and in the meantime, he's just stirring up his supporters, who kind of they treat him as a god. They'll believe anything he says, and to the point, they storm the Capitol. Once again, that's never happened. Actually, it has happened in the United States. Something like I think in the Revolutionary War or something in the 1920s or 70s, they did it, and that was crazy. And it's also crazy, frankly, how easy they did it. I can't believe there's a couple dozen police officers that are charged with protecting the Capitol when every single senator is there. It's like and all the House of Representatives are there. It's like the entire government, the vice president is there. Everybody, the entirety of the U.S. government was in that building, and a bunch of wackos, stormed it. Insane.
Yes,
What
yes. I
nuts. And
think
once again, there's the divided country. Obviously, there's a Democratic side that I'm on is just like, thinks, I can't believe this happened. I can't believe you would support this person. This is not democratic values. But then you have the Republicans who still insist that the election was stolen. They had every right to go storm the Capitol and make it right.
I think that that looks really really weird for us in Europe because it's sort of self damaging situation in the US. I have to say that if there is only one thing that I could have agreed with the policies of Donald Trump was a little bit his sort of I mean, if you can really pick something, it was I think the relationship with China, which it's also a very very interest like the it's in my opinion personally the Western capitalism ignores everything that is going on there in terms of human rights and what they're doing in with some minorities and stuff like that in the name of profit because it's very very cheap to build there. But we saw that when a global pandemic kicked in, the whole masks war, the whole thing, that was everything has a I think Trump was sort of a huge red light that that turn on for the rest of the politicians around the globe, so that they actually now hope learn the lesson that if they don't, they have to be very very well. How to say it, in a proper way, they have to do a good job to avoid this and spend money in my opinion in education and stuff like that, because for example for me one big disadvantage of the US being so big is that people who are not coming from the right sort of say social layer, they really cannot experience foreigners and see that we're all the same. Like, I mean, me, you are now sitting in Seattle, I'm sitting in Frankfurt, we're chatting about topics that really relate to us as human being. And on this podcast, I have the opportunity to talk with people from Iran, which is probably the most opposite of the US, with people from Mexico, with people from India, and more or less on the surface, we're different, but deep down we're all very much similar. It's really amazing how similar we are actually around the globe. So I hope that the lessons were learned through these 4 years sort of
I would hope
craziness.
so too, although I don't have honestly a lot of hope. I think, the United States has some serious problems, although it always has. We've had a history of social inequity and violence for the last several hundred years. It's the history of the United States, and I think all the time. Once again, you have these people in the United States that just don't want change. They're they're white or they're from European ancestry, and they think America is white, and they don't want to give the same opportunities to new people to this country, and I think that's just ridiculous. I think, sometimes I think of myself, and here I am in the United States. I was born a white male in the United States to parents who are still married, who paid for my college education. I have won the lottery. I don't know what percentage of the entire global population kind of fits in that category, but it's got to be far less than even 1%. It's like I have nothing to complain about my situation in life, given just my birthright. And I don't understand why more people don't see things that way. We're just so lucky to be born who I was. I can't complain to anybody. I would be more than happy. I feel it's my social and patriotic duty to try to give a hand up. We do have a lot of, in this state, there's a lot of, there's a migrant workforce that works in, harvesting, fruits and vegetables during the season, usually from, Central or South America, or Mexico. But also, we have a construction company, and we have most of the people that are on our construction sites are immigrants, and it's really, really interesting. Some legal and some illegal. That's one of the coolest part actually about having a construction company. Is like the guys that do the concrete work and the wood framing, they're all Hispanic crew. Mostly they speak Spanish, and the guys that actually install the doors and the finished flooring, they are all a Chinese crew, and maybe only one of them, kind of the foreman, speaks good English. And the guys that do the siding, typically the siders are a lot of Ukrainians. I don't know why all the Ukrainians, they have a real good sense of craft. So you have all these kind of different, subcontractors on these job sites, and they all come from, different backgrounds. But I swear to God, they work so freaking hard. These guys they work on Christmas Day. They work on Thanksgiving. They'll work in the rain, in the snow. They'll work in the dark. They know the meaning of hard work, and the fact that you would try to not give these people an opportunity to succeed is just infuriates me.
Yeah, I think that also, I mean, you cannot generalize because from every groups of people, if you take a big amount of them, there will be some people which are not okay. Myself, I'm a kid of immigrants. They have immigrated from Bulgaria to Italy, and now I moved to Germany, and I don't feel it anymore that much as immigration because it's within the European Union, which for us is something new. What in the US is normal, that you just move in another country, you don't need to do any paperwork, you just settle down, find a job, start working. Of course, you need to learn the language, which is something different. But I think that the point of immigrants is that usually, as we said, I come from Bulgaria, and in Bulgaria now it's also a part of the European Union, and it's getting better and better. But people during especially the communist year, which weren't so long time ago. My parents were they grew up in that environment, and as soon as they got the opportunity to really work, freely earn money, they really, you never put in question like, I have an opportunity to work no matter, as you said, no matter what day it is, of if it's a Christmas weekend, whatever. It's finally these people have a free opportunity to work on their own fortune and improve their social status. So this is and this is what is also happening in China, for example. Like I've heard with a lot of Chinese, that they say they don't question politics there, because they just focus on working, because they finally have this growing, booming economy, and they're focusing just on improving their social status, and they don't care about anything on the side. But it's interesting because here in Europe also, we have the workers are mainly from Eastern or Southern Europe, which are the poorest countries in 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 the, um, in Europe, in the European Union. And so it's funny because we don't understand here in Europe the concept in the US of guns education, which costs incredibly much. The healthcare, and also we don't have this really conception of white privilege here. Maybe because we have racism within white white people. Because I am white, but when I was a kid as a Bulgarian immigrant, I have experienced some sort of, I don't know if you can say racism, but yeah, discrimination or something like that. So these are concepts that here we don't divide each other through really the color of the skin, but maybe some do, but not mainly. Like because we're so different culturally. And how was in this when the pandemic kicked in? Did this time was your company now stable enough to go through the waves, or did that somehow affected your work? How was that?
Well, we have kind of three businesses. One is the architecture firm, and one is a development company, and one is a construction company. And they're all kind of impacted a little bit differently. The architecture firm primarily now is working on larger buildings, bigger urban infill apartment buildings and things like that. And it takes, here in Seattle, it takes several years to design and permit them. It's a very, very strict permitting process. So we had new projects, big projects that we'd started before the pandemic that the clients weren't going to stop. So we just kept working on through them. And, basically sometime in March, I guess, the entire office started to work remotely, and they're working from home, and they're still working from home. I haven't seen our staff in almost a year. I see some of them time to time, but most of them, I literally have not seen them. We get on with Zoom calls, and we have a little happy hour once a week and try to keep our communication up. But it's been remarkable that the architecture firm has been, most people have worked with us for quite a while, and they know their jobs and they know their responsibilities, and the projects themselves are very kind of deadline driven, and people knew what they needed to do to meet those deadlines. And so working from home, I think it's actually remarkably, it hasn't impacted our productivity at all. In fact, I think some people really relish the opportunity. They like working at night. They like working different hours. And I think, frankly, it's been good for some of our employees. They have young kids, and I think they could look back on this time, and it's kind of a blessing. They get to spend time with their 2 and 3 and 4 year olds, which otherwise they wouldn't. They're there at home with them every day, in these kind of formative times of their lives. And I think you kind of talk about work-life balance. I think that actually this pandemic has actually enabled a certain work-life balance that working at an office wouldn't. The construction
How
company
do
is a
you
little different.
how
Like go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was curious. How did you see this? How do you see these opportunities as an entrepreneur and as the sort of the one of the leader of the company? Because I generally think that Americans are more open minded towards new things, and here in Europe we're more conservative. And for example, here in Europe, both sides, it's not seen that well. Like I personally would like some hybrid system in the future where you have more flexibility to when you need to stay home, when you want to go to the office, to go in the office. But especially from the architectural field, I hear from a lot of people that they say, yeah, I don't know, I don't like that kind of work. It doesn't really work that well in our industry. um, I think that basically it's because they want to have more control over their employees, because of some mistrust issues or stuff like that. How do you see this new way of working?
Well, like I say, I think for us to kind of continue working on the projects we already had has worked out very well because everyone kind of knows their role. Where it's been more difficult is, not surprisingly, is through the kind of initial early design process and the collaborative process of being able to just sit down over a table with some sketch paper and sketch out some ideas together, or even just, be sitting at your desk and have a thought about something like, why don't we do this? Why don't we try that? It's really hard to do. It's not nearly as spontaneous. You have to schedule a meeting where you sit down with people and you try to share a computer screen and someone has control over it. I think the tools for design collaboration in architecture, I don't think are very robust right now. And so that's been difficult. And as a result, I think I've had to kind of just honestly, like I said, we always start a project by talking a lot. So generally we'll start a new project and we'll do a little site analysis, try to understand the site, what we're trying to achieve with it, and then talk a lot and talk about what we can do, or maybe have some precedents of other approaches to any given project that we thought were successful. And kind of once everyone kind of has all the ideas out there, then it's just a matter of kind of someone synthesizing it and kind of creating the architecture from it. And usually that's my role. So, unfortunately that part has been less collaborative. I just have to kind of take the designs further than I would otherwise to try to kind of get them fully resolved before you involve the larger team, because it's just difficult to collaborate in that way.
And you were about to say also how did it affect the other two companies? You have a construction and a developer company.
Well, the construction company, once again, we just kind of seamlessly started working remotely for the architecture firm. But the construction company, you can't work remotely. We had 2 projects that we were building, and for a period of time, I think they actually, they cracked down on. In Seattle, it's actually the people in Seattle, once again, they're very science believers or liberal. Seattle is one of the places, although the pandemic kind of started here in the United States, it's actually the incident of infection is very, very, very low, because people do wear masks here and people follow the rules. And the governor is very science driven. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they actually stopped all construction for a couple months. And that was hard. I mean, that stopped our projects and stopped the work for the people working on those projects. But they started that back up again, and you have these new protocol where the people on site, of course, have to wear masks, and you have all these hand washing stations, and you have to take a list of who's there and their contact information. You can't have more than 8 people on the job site a day for some of these projects. So there's all these kind of new safety protocols that are in place now that we abide by. But, now things are moving along just like normal. You just go out to the site and it's just kind of like it used to be, but everyone's wearing a mask. The development company, frankly, hasn't been impacted. Well, we had also two projects under construction that we were going to sell. We had like a total of 8 units, townhouse units that we were building that then we were intending to sell. So when the pandemic first happened, remember the stock market just went way down, and I was really out there financially, and I was very, very concerned that this could be another Great Recession event and it would just get hammered again like it did in 2009. But the ironic thing that happened is there's all these people, Seattle is this, I don't know if you know, but it's like a super tech city. Amazon is based here. And of course, Microsoft is based here. And now there's all these other satellite offices for Google and Apple. So there's a huge, huge tech industry here. And everyone, I would say everyone, but a lot of people that live in the urban core are in tech and they have money. And they used to maybe rent or buy or rent a big fancy apartment. But then they would get tired of being cooped up in their big fancy apartments. So they've all gone out and bought houses and townhouses. So the housing market has actually gone up something like 15% in Seattle over the last year for things to buy, because people that were renting want more space and don't want to go up an elevator 40 stories to their apartment. So ironically, the for sale housing market that we deal with as developers has improved over the last year, while the rental market is in the tank. There's tremendous vacancy in apartment buildings right now. There's been a lot of people that have chose to move to a larger place where they're working remotely and like, why am I paying $3,000 a month to live in the middle of the city here? I'm not going to the office anymore. I can go get a house out somewhere for $1,500 a month and have more space. So as a result, the city's kind of emptied out, and the downtown is shuttered. There's no one's working downtown. There's people somewhat still living downtown, but a lot less of them. It's really bleak when you go downtown. Now there's boards over all the windows. There was also, I don't know about, there were riots, or I would say riots is not the right word, protests over the summer. That was all in Seattle as part of the racial inequities here, and all of it is like it's not doing that great if you go downtown right now.
I've heard because I listen to a lot of the American podcasts. Also, I listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. If you have heard about it, and they were talking about this. I don't know because now they're getting to be too many, but I don't know if it's Antifa or something like this that
Yep,
they
Antifa. Yep.
yeah, they locked. They separated part of Seattle and they declared it sort of autonomous. And then there was a lot of crazy stuff going on there. Is that like true, or because sometimes when I listen to this podcast, I think I don't know. This is sounds too crazy, too crazy to me. But basically that they really like separated. They were like armed people guarding it and crazy stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean well, first of all, I don't think it's always. I think the media portrayed it probably more more I guess violent than it really was. It's actually right. That's the CHOP, they call it, Capitol Hill Occupied Protest. It's literally right across the street from my office in Capitol Hill. My office is in Capitol Hill. I look 40 feet. I'm on the second story, and I look down, and that's it. That's where the barricades were. So I was down there, and I actually still, most everyone else works from home, but I still go to the office because I like the office. All my stuff is there, and that's where all the bookkeeping and checks have to come in and out of there. So I was always going during the summer during the CHOP. But yeah, that was like, as part of the George Floyd killings that happened over the summer. There are definitely, it's a liberal place, and Antifa that's a big deal. I mean, but Antifa stands for anti-fascist. So who's really like pro-fascist, and there's also like, there's a big community here in the Pacific Northwest in particular of anarchists who don't believe in any kind of organized government whatsoever. But they did organize themselves well enough to actually, I think they were the ones that were really the anarchists, were the ones that created the CHOP and walled off the city. What they did is they surrounded the police station in my neighborhood, which is on the same block as my office. And the cops abandoned the police station. They literally left because they were afraid it was going to get burned down. And I can't believe the cops would do that, but they did. And then there were no police in the neighborhood for a month or more. But it wasn't violent. It was more like frankly, a summer street fair. People were, there was free food, there was street entertainers, there was summertime here, and everyone was in a jovial mood. I honestly don't. They made it out to be this big violent thing with armed guards. I never saw any of that. It was just all blown over for sensationalism.
I see, but that still sounds very, very surreal for me. It's a very interesting story, and yeah, like stuff like that. Like I don't know, we don't see. I personally never saw like a policeman here in Europe anywhere I was. Some like never consider even them barely like an enemy. They're more like I feel always like safer when I see like policemen around because you know that they're gonna if something happens they're gonna just solve it and it's gonna be good. So,
Well, I
but I
think a big
guess
problem we have here is that personally in Seattle, is that most of the police here in Seattle, they do not live in Seattle. They live in the suburbs somewhere. They want to raise their families in some place that's safe. because in their job they're exposed to all the things that are unsafe, on a daily basis. And from my standpoint, there's unsafe things that happen out there, but I don't see it every day. So anyway, they kind of they treat their job as if they're a military force occupying a violent city. And I think that's a big problem. I think that Seattle should, require or at least encourage their police force to actually live in the communities that they police.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's the thing. And you mentioned you went to the office, so I'm curious. How does your workday look like today? Because you're also the manager of this whole bunch of things that are going on. Are you still really on hands on or draw a part of sketching? Do you also have time to draw yourself something on a computer, or how does it look like?
Yeah, well, I have I generally have a couple meetings, appointments set out through the day, and we have this one right now, and then later this afternoon, I think at 1, I've got to go look at a job site of a building that's under construction, and then at 3, I have another call with a new client. And kind of in between that time, there's 2 new projects that we're designing right now that just started that I kind of keep those always on my desk and try to work on those a few hours a day. You don't really just I can't really just sit down and just, in 12 hours design a building. The way my process, I like to kind of do a little bit of work on it, set it aside and think about it, and then work on something else and set it aside. So it's kind of a few hours a day or a period of weeks. So, kind of in between these calls, I'll sit down and I do a lot of work in SketchUp, or then I'll do a rough plan or something in AutoCAD, and then I'll print it and then sketch over the top of it and look at different variations. And, at some point, maybe I'd involve some other people in a firm that would further develop a SketchUp model or start putting all the windows and materials on the outside or do some renderings of it. But right now, these are really, really early. So it's kind of a matter of you have to, it's also somewhat of a sales job. I have to create something that I think is important architecturally, the best of my ability, and then sell my client on it. So much of architecture is that in the case of the stuff we develop, I'm the client. We can do what we want. But a lot of the larger buildings, I'm not the client. I have a client that I have to sell them on what I think is important to the building. And sometimes the things that we're wanting to do are going to cost more money to do high quality materials. And you have to convince them of the value of that. But yeah, my day is generally pretty flexible. And normally, like I say, I'll also go to work several times a week because I have to sign checks and get the mail. And that's really where all my stuff is. I have a home office here, but I don't have a lot of stuff here. All my stuff is at the office.
And is there any hierarchy in your office? Because I saw on the website you can see some pictures of your team. Also, I guess of your dog or somebody's
Oh
dog
yeah,
in the.
yeah, that's my
But
dog. Yeah, he's here. He's at home with me today.
he has a funny picture, anyways. But it's a relatively small team for the projects you do. So I don't know, here in some, no matter what, I mean, if it's that size, the company, I don't know, but generally you have project managers, junior architects, I don't know, senior architects, level 1, 2, I don't know. Do you have any sort of hierarchy in your office, or is it pretty much a flat hierarchy and everybody works on everything?
No, I think we have somewhat of a hierarchy. There's I think there's like 11 of us in the office, and I think 4 of us are kind of the core management team. And we we used to meet once a week in the mornings to kind of talk about all the projects and the process and who's doing what. And one of the first things I think is a good thing we did when the pandemic started, we now have a digital meeting Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, first thing in the morning, and to make sure that all the work is being delegated. and then we have all these tools that have been good. I think there's something called Asana that you can assign people tasks to, and so the four of us kind of talk about everyone's role, and then the other three they have people that kind of they're collaborating with or working with, and they then delegate various tasks for different projects. And I don't really have to. I don't get that involved in the granular level of it, of the kind of the day-to-day operations of the individual projects. But it has been, in the course of my career, it's been amazing, frankly, that, when I started the career, for instance, I mentioned, things were still hand drafted, and they were just then starting to have AutoCAD, which is really, it's just the same kind of thing, but it's just drafted in a flat 2D computer. Now, of course, everything is on Revit, and Revit has definitely revolutionized the creation of at least a permanent set of drawings. I don't think it's a very good design tool, but you can do a pretty large building pretty efficiently with a pretty small group of people. And it's become, very efficient now because you build the model and you just keep adding to the model and the elevations get updated. There used to be so much time spent kind of coordinating various drawings. You move a wall, or you move a window, you got to move it in plan, you got to move it in elevation, you got to move it in section, you got to move it on some window schedule somewhere. Now that's all embedded in the model. So it has been very, very efficient. Frankly, and I think the architecture profession used to be very cumbersome and people didn't get paid very much. It wasn't a very efficient process. But people actually on the West Coast they get paid pretty well. And I get paid pretty well because the process has become much more efficient.
Yes, that's true. I also had the opportunity to talk with, if you are aware, with big Bjork Ingels architects with their BIM manager in New York, and we were talking about that in the past you would see these enormous rooms with people with the drawing tables and everybody drawing something, a huge amount of people to build a building, and now you have, I don't know, building teams of 2, 3, 5 people, and then they are doing the same massive buildings. So it's crazy how many jobs were absorbed, and the automatization of this beam technologies. It's crazy. And is there anything that you delegate outside? Because when you go on your website, beside all the built projects you can find, there are also a lot of very nice renderings. Oh, is that all done in house, or do you delegate something like that outside?
Look, a little bit of both. I think some of we work with a renderer, I think named Li Feng, and they're in China actually. They render some of our projects. Some of it we use a software called Inkscape, which we can build our own
Oh yeah.
renderings, through SketchUp or through Revit, and we can kind of do that in house. We have a guy actually that we hired that he's actually really kind of solely focused on the kind of front end design side of things, and he's actually working from Thailand right now. He was from Bangkok and had to return for Bangkok for some citizenship related things and hasn't been able to get back. So he's been working the last couple months in Bangkok and will be there for another couple months. But yeah, we would prefer to kind of do most of that in house just because, if you're looking over everyone's shoulder, it's just a lot easier to say, let's tweak this. That's not quite right. We kind of want to use the visualization to actually help visualize the project while we're still designing it, not get it all designed and then create a render on it.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me because, as I told you before, I was considering come to the US. I was thinking, I informed very well myself because I know how strict are the US sort of control departments about immigration and things like that. And I was planning to come on a holiday and before coming there, sending my portfolio to a couple of firms, and tell them like, look guys, if you like my work, I'm also coming, so we can meet in person and discuss some opportunities. I'm curious, what is the wage in like average amounts in Seattle for an architect with a couple of years of experience? Here in Europe, I think varies a lot between the countries, because if you, for instance, go to Italy, the situation is very bad on that industry. So you get very low money. If you get €1,000 a month, it's a big success. And here in Germany, it depends, but we vary for like, in the end, clean after tax, it's a couple of €1,000 a month. What is the situation in the US? Because also for me, it's hard to understand. You always say in the US, I think you say everything before taxes, and then you have taxes, you have health insurance. That, for instance, I still don't exactly know how it works in the US. And so if you could explain that a little bit.
Well, I would say that, maybe first of all, it's definitely Seattle, because of the tech industry. It's been experiencing a lot of growth. So there's a big demand for architects. Plus, it's just an expensive part of the country to live in. Um, so in Seattle, actually, the wage is higher probably than most part of the country in general. Like, the wage is always going to be higher on the coast, on Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, the bigger cities, than in the middle of the country. And I guess people, when they just get out of school, maybe their first job, maybe they'd be making roughly $50,000 a year, maybe a little bit more. That's before taxes. So, but really the taxes aren't terribly much if that's all you're making. So maybe your take-home pay would be a little over $40,000 a year. And, we actually provide the employer. It's by no means mandated by the government, but the employer pays for the health insurance. I pay for their insurance. So that's in addition. They'll basically get $50,000 a year plus the benefits. So the benefits would be, we provide health insurance. We provide a 401k retirement plan for them. We provide paid vacations, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the starting salary. Take home pay is probably low 40s after taxes, but that your healthcare is already covered. We provide a bus pass, all kinds of things like that. So I'm not sure really what that is in euros, but that's a relatively good wage. Frankly, it's a lot more than I made when I was out of college, but it's also a very expensive place to live. Unfortunately, that salary doesn't go very far in Seattle. And maybe after you've gotten 10 years of experience or something, or you're highly valued in your job, maybe you make $75,000, $80,000 a year before taxes. And it's generally, I think we pay competitively, but you definitely make more money at a bigger firm. The bigger firm you are, they seem to pay more. I think not a tremendous amount more, but a little more.
Yes. Well, I think it sounds pretty similar to Germany, because in Germany it works like this. You get a figure. Let's say if you get 40,000 per year, which is not that much. But you have to consider that you're gonna get roughly 60% of it, because here in Europe you have 40% of taxes, which means half of the money for example, health insurance is paid from your employer, half of the money from the employee. Then we have retirement tax, which you pay whether to the state, or if you're a member of the architecture union or chamber or whatever it's called, you can decide to pay to their own retirement system. And then you have we pay other taxes like unemployment taxes, because if you get fired, for example, you have, I think, a couple of years of, you get 80% of your wage
Yeah, that's all
for.
very similar to what we have here. You have unemployment insurance is taken out of the salary. You have your federal income taxes, which should be, if you're maybe making $50,000 a year, like basically the more money you make, the higher your salary, the higher your taxes are. So
Yes.
if your salary is low, maybe only 15% of your salary is taken out as federal taxes. That includes like Social Security, which is basically retirement benefits that the government provides. When you're 65, you pay into that basically your entire career. Um,
Yes.
and then, the 401k thing, I guess, we pay into it, and then, or they can choose. I guess employees can choose to contribute 5% up to 15 or 20% of their salary, and then we match that. We have a pretty generous plan that will match up to 15% of the 401k. So they choose to contribute 15% to their own retirement account, then we match 15% to their retirement account, which ends up being a lot. Now that's like 30%. And we strongly encourage people to try to do as much as possible when you're as young as possible, because it accrues interest over time. And the longer it's in there, the better that is.
Yes, but I think also what I don't know, in the US there is this big topic that, for example, I guess that when you are a graduate of an architecture school, you probably will end up with some debt before we before you start working. So you'll need to be paying that back for some years, I suppose. I don't know what, but of course, probably the tuitions are different based on where you're going
Yeah,
to
that's true. It
study.
can be very expensive to go to school out here, and a lot of people do come out of school with a lot of debt.
Yeah,
It's hard. I
because
mean, there's a
here,
whole generation. Like there's the millennial generation, or there's people that are maybe in their 30s now. They kind of came out of school with all this debt, and they came right in when the recession was happening in 2009 or 2010. And it's really stunted their careers. It's been hard when you enter a salary or enter a profession when the salaries are lower or the opportunities are lower because of recession. That's kind of the foundation that all your future earnings are going to be based on. So I feel like it's been a tough time for people that entered the profession at that time. Certainly more so than me. I think I was lucky in that, it was a recession when I came in, but we recovered from it fairly quickly. And college wasn't as expensive then. As I said before, my parents paid for my college. That was a blessing for me. I didn't come out of school with a lot of debt.
yeah, here in Europe, it's basically, for example, in Italy, if you are studying architecture, you pay your tuition based on the income of your family if you're still living with them, or if you're living on your own and you have very low income, it will be basically some very small amount of money. For example, I don't come from a very rich family, so we would pay something like 700 euros per semester, which wasn't that huge. So if you count, I studied 10 years, it's around 7,000 euros, which is not much. But if
Wow.
you're
Yeah, that's not much.
yeah, if you come from the maximum you could have paid was 3,500 a year, which per 5 years is again 15,000 euros more like reasonable, and you're supposed to be able to pay that money if that's that high. Your family must be very rich. And here in Germany it's more, because Italy, it's like a country where the culture is more, like you stay with your parents longer. It's not very much like a country where people get independent very quickly. And here in Germany, it's basically a flat rate to everybody pay. But it's, I think for university, you actually pay 50 euro a semester, but you pay like 400 because they give you a student card. And with this card, you access all the, you actually pay the transportation because you pay 350 euro 6 months transportation and all, like you get a lot of advantages with the student card, because if you go to the cinema, you get some discount. If you go in a museum, you get in for free. So it's pretty good. And when your student life can be pretty cheap, Also, when you work as a student, as an intern, you pay just 10% taxes. You don't pay all the taxes. So company are also, that's why it's very easy to get into the working environment here in Germany. And yeah, and the university is more or less free. So it was, I was also very lucky because I got out of university actually with plus, because I was working and saving some money. So that was definitely something something that we're pretty lucky here in Europe, that we have this system which is pretty easy to access if you wanted to.
Yeah, sounds good. Much more equitable.
Well, Rob, I think we covered most of it. I think it was very interesting to hear the story of hybrid architects. It's I thought the name was because you're hybrid, because you actually do everything, like construct your developers and architects itself. So I think the initial name fit in completely your business currently as well.
Yeah,
And
I'll kind of share a little story about that real quick. It was like the competition team when asked to, we were asked actually by a group to enter the first competition, and Joel and I, my original partner, talked about, well, who do we want to have on our team? And we could have had a bunch of architects on the team, but then we'd had this all group thing. So we thought, well, what are values that are important to Seattleites? And why don't we go build a team full of experts in those values? So we ended up getting urban ecologists and landscape architects and fine artists and a very diverse team. We asked a really diverse group of people to join our competition team. And actually, one of the people on our team suggested that they call it team hybrid because of our diverse backgrounds. And it just so happened that stuck. But I think that was also really important. That's the best thing you ever did. I'd give to anyone is try, if you're going to start a firm or start a career, start it under some values that you believe strongly in. And once again, that'll be the foundation of your portfolio that you can slowly build over time.
something that I don't know if I missed it in the story or if I didn't ask you, but at what point did you guys split with your original partner? What happened? If it's not some touchy question.
No, Joel's still a good friend of mine, and we would, I mean, we were just friends and colleagues, and we would have beers and we'd talk about crazy things. We played in a band together, and then we started this competition team together that eventually kind of became hybrid. And Joel was really, kind of enthusiastic type of person, and very creative in the kind of the branding of cargo texture, and he had really more an affinity for cargo containers, and I had other interests like in development and in um, uh, uh, general contracting and things of that nature. So I think as a firm kind of started to evolve, our interests were kind of diverging. So we discussed kind of a buyout, probably 7, 8 years ago, where I basically sold my interest in cargotexture.com, which he still has and still does, cargotexture.com. He's the container guy. I sold my interest in that business to him, and he sold his interest in the architecture firm and the construction company to me. And once again, I think we still remain friends, and at the time it was like certainly the foundation of those values. They really core beliefs. Honestly, were probably more his than mine. He's a really artistic type of guy, and I was more the kind of pragmatic, solution based guy. So that was another great thing. That's where I think really kind of had when the firm started, it was great to have a guy that would just have crazy ass ideas. And I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. And I would somehow find a way to get these crazy ass ideas executed and turn them into kind of somehow distill crazy ideas into actual architecture. That was kind of more my role. So as the firm grew, we were doing more and more, frankly, architecture and less crazy ideas. And there was becoming pressure, frankly, also from our clients. Then it'd be like, those ideas are too crazy. What are you thinking? He's always so. And I would love, frankly, I would love that the best of our worlds would have hybrid could have just continued to do crazy ideas. It's like it's actually it's honestly really hard to build a business around nothing but crazy ideas. I I I think there are some firms out there that do them, but even Eric Ingles, he's like those are somewhat crazy looking buildings, but they're also very pragmatic buildings. And he's got clients that have to pay the bills with these buildings. He can't really be. It's very difficult to be a true artist in architecture unless you're doing really small things, which is once again what I think we enjoy doing as our developer stuff. Smaller things we can experiment with some new ideas.
Yes, I think they look crazy, but they're like, everything he does actually, it's also have an impact on the profit because whether if it looks crazy is because it's gonna dramatically augment, for example, the build surface or something like that. So his clients are like, okay, it looks crazy, but I'm gonna sell like triple the amount of surface that I would have done. So, I mean, they look crazy, but they're not.
I mean, they're
They're
not really
not
crazy. I mean, they're really like when you see the
a
diagrams of
lot.
where it came from. It's like they're really not crazy. They were kind of very derived through a very pragmatic kind of process. I mean, it's like you think about like the Art Ingles. I think I have a lot of respect for those designs. Whereas like Frank Gehry, I think obviously those crazy designs, but it's all like it's kind of for show. It's not really functional. It's this crazy ass roof that doesn't keep the water out, and it's just this kind of piece of sculpture. And I think I appreciate that, and I think it has value as well. But honestly, in the United States right now, we have a
Yes,
housing crisis, and it's housing is very, very expensive right now. And I kind of take it as one of our core values actually to create affordable housing, and affordable housing does by its nature has to be quite pragmatic. We build everything out of wood here. How much I would love to build a big concrete building, and the things you get away with building out of concrete and steel, but that's not almost every building that we have on our website and portfolio is a wood frame building, which is more cost effective, but it's limiting.
I think but it's also, for example, environmental friendly compared to concrete. And in Europe, we're starting to go the opposite way, where we start building more and more with wood.
No, you're right.
But
You're
I
right.
think I think your company was really, as I told you in the beginning of our conversation, it was a huge surprise for me because I saw this project on, I think it was really on the cover of Arc Daily or some website like that. And I saw this beautiful building, and I was thinking that's a project in Europe somewhere. And then I saw Seattle, and I told myself, yeah, I'll try to contact these guys, and maybe they're on Arc Daily and they're like too too snobby to even consider my. They probably got a lot of invitations, but then it happened, and I'm really honored to have had the opportunity to talk to you. It was a really enlightening conversation, and I hope that soon we'll be able to travel again, and I'll be able to finally come visit the U.S. and maybe pass by hybrid architecture in Seattle and check it real in real life.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I really do appreciate you reaching out. Like I say, it's like I think I mentioned this before that I like architects and I like architecture, and honestly, I can talk for hours about it. People interview me for things, I just keep going and going and going. I think we've been talking for almost 2 hours now. I could easily talk another 2 hours because I just love it. So I really do appreciate you reaching out. I appreciate the kind words you said about some of our projects, and we hope to do more.
Yeah, and I always say to the guests that this is just the first time you are on the podcast, but it's not said that it's gonna be the last one. And also, I'm currently working together with my girlfriend. She's also helping me out with this podcast, and we're working on making it in a video format too soon. So maybe we can do some other podcast where we go through your designs, and maybe you reveal some. Backstage stories, and I'm sure we can figure out another fun conversation about architecture and about what you do, because it's really cool. And you can also say now where people can find you on internet, or where they can find more about hybrid. So whoever listens to this can go check it out itself himself.
Oh, right. Yeah. So our website is Hybrid Arc. It's Hybrid ARC. It stands for Architecture, Research, and Construction. So hybridarc.com. And I think actually the Instagram handle is also Hybrid Arc, Hybrid ARC. Actually, we're in the process of rebuilding our website. I think it should be finished in the next couple of weeks. So excited about that too.
Great. And I think that we actually gonna release your podcast in the next couple of weeks. So probably people gonna check the new version, and I'm gonna put all the links in the description. And before we go, I want to remind also whoever listens that if they like this program, they can also follow our social media, which are at TCI Podcast on Instagram and the Creative Insider on LinkedIn and Facebook. And we have also a little newsletter every month where we send you the sum up of the best of the month, so people can decide if they want to listen one episode or the other, or listen at all. So thank you, Rob, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank
Bye
you,
bye.
Georgi. You take care and stay safe. Bye bye.
The whole world stops just like that. The whole world stops just like that. The whole world stops just like that.